All right, welcome anyone who's here so far. We're just going to get started in a couple minutes. Thank you for joining if you're already here. We're excited to have this conversation, and I'll just give it a minute or two to let some more folks come in. Then we're excited to dig into our panel and Q&A. Welcome if anyone's still joining. We'll get started in just a minute. Okay, thanks folks for joining. Good evening, wherever you are, assuming it's evening your time. We'll just give it just a couple more seconds and then we'll get started. Awesome. Okay, well, I'm gonna get started because we've got a lot of interesting and exciting stuff to cover tonight, and we want to be sure that we have time for questions and discussion as well. So just to start things off, I'm Tim, and I'm the SVP of Labor Programs at Tech Equity. We are really honored to have a great panel with here today to talk about data rights in California. We'll get started in just a minute, but I just wanted to share a little bit of information about Tech Equity. We are the hosts of this event tonight. We're a nonprofit organization that started in California. Here's our mission and vision. We work to ensure that the tech industry's growth benefits everyone. We focus on economic equity where tech meets housing and labor. And we use research, advocacy, and policy, as well as enforcement to ensure that communities benefit from tech and that the industry is held accountable. Housing and labor are our two major focuses. As part of our work, we engage tech workers to take action on building an economy where everyone benefits from the growth that tech has created. So we want to thank you all for being part of that and joining us today for this session. We hope that no matter what experience inspired you to join us today, that you leave feeling empowered and with more information to support yourself and your coworkers in the tech industry. To help create a space that is inclusive and respectful, we are using Tech Equity's Code of Conduct, and my colleague Herman will be dropping that in the chat so you can check that out as well. Just wanted to note that this session is being recorded. The presentation part of the session will be recorded. We will not be recording the Q&A section. This is so that we can create resources to share with folks who are not able to join us, but would still like information about this topic in the future. You will also get an email with the recording so you can look back at all this information and the great insight that is shared tonight later. And then just wanted to clarify that participants will not be visible and your names or anything like that will not be included in the recording. Please use the Q&A feature to share questions as they come up during the presentation. And also thank you to folks who submitted questions ahead of time. Just a reminder that this is for educational purposes. It is not legal advice. And yeah, with that, we are very excited to bring in some experts to talk to you about how you can exercise your data rights in California. If you're based in California, you are lucky to be in a state that has some of the few protections that exist in the United States for workers related to the data that is collected about them by employers. So first we'll be hearing from Kung Feng, who is the policy and project analyst at UC Berkeley Labor Center. Kang works to understand the implications of the California Consumer Privacy Act, which we'll be learning all about tonight. And also was previously an executive director of Jobs with Justice San Francisco, and has been involved in the labor movement as a rank and file activist and a union organizer as well. So we're very lucky to have Kang with us tonight. Then we'll be hearing from Jason. I should have asked you, Jason, how to pronounce your last name. I don't, I don't want to butcher it.
Jason Munderlow.
Munderla. Okay, there you
Got
go.
it.
Yeah, that's pretty intuitive. I could have gotten that. And Jason is an app-based worker in California who's been working as an app-based driver for 10 years, as a member and leader of Gig Workers Rising for 5 years. He joined Gig Worker Rising to make positive change for app-based drivers working together, and also has a really interesting interest in ecological forestry, which I'd love to hear more about. If it comes up, I'd love to hear more. Great. So then we'll hear from Jason about his own experience exerting his data rights in California, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answer as well. So on that note, I will hand it over to Kang. And yeah, thanks everyone for being here, and we're excited to have you. Take it away, Kang.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much to Tech Equity for hosting us here and talking about data rights in California, which is just such an important topic. So I'm really excited to be here with you all today. First, we're going to focus on data rights under a specific California law, which, as Tim mentioned, is called the California Consumer Privacy Act. First, we'll give a little background. We're going to warm it up first. Then we'll actually talk through the law. And finally, we're going to finish with more of a practical walkthrough on exercising one of our data rights. And this material is drawn from a toolkit that we have on this subject called Your Work, Your Data, a toolkit for exercising worker data rights under the California Consumer Privacy Act. And we'll get to that link for you in the future. So this is really framed as a how-to, right? Like a practical guide to this law, because rights are really only as meaningful as when they're actually exercised. So to start with some background and just to ground us really, because I know we have a range of people on this call, so some of this may already be familiar to some of us, but I do want to establish a shared context for the California Consumer Privacy Act. So question, what do these technologies have in common? These are pictures of a floor cleaner robot over there on the left of your screen, a ride-sharing platform in the middle, and then computer vision software that identifies whether workers are wearing safety gear. So this is a little chance to be interactive and drop out in the chat what you think these technologies have in common. Feel free to hit that chat at the bottom and pop up. And anybody want to not leave me hanging here? Surveillance, that's a good one. They all collect data. Yeah, tracking. You guys are right on target. I mean, this is the theme of tonight, right? So yes, they are all data driven. Data is the common denominator for an incredibly broad range of digital technologies that are at work today, right? So there's this common phrase, data is the new oil. What do people mean by that? I mean, really, it is highlighting how important data is and that it's an immensely valuable resource and it's being extracted for profit and is central to our economy. Another way to look at this metaphor is also to understand that data is literally being the fuel that powers the major digital technologies of today, right? The floor cleaner robot, the rideshare platform, the computer vision software. And in the workplace, that means that employers and vendors are extracting data and they're buying the data, and then they're using data-driven technologies to control work and workers. So let's pop the hood. This is sort of like a very basic outline of how this is working and what's so important about data, right? In the first stage, the employer is collecting or buying worker data. Then it feeds into a computer program that looks for patterns in the data and produces outputs. And then the employer uses these outputs and makes decisions. So there's a lot of kinds of data, job activity data, biometric data, so forth, right, that can be fed into this machine, right? And they can collect it by electronic monitoring on your job, or they can have you fill out forms, or they can even buy it from data brokers. In the second stage, right, this is what people are talking about when they're talking about AI these days, like machine learning and large language models. But basically, there's a computer program that's looking for patterns, and after it's being fed large amounts of data, and then it spits out things like task direction or schedules or so forth. And finally, the employer can make decisions, let's say around hiring or firing or promotion based on these outputs. And we really want to emphasize this because throughout this stage, there are human decisions being made. Technology is not destiny, and employers are using these technologies to make choices. So a little closer look at worker data. Um, Note that some of this data, like your credit report or your social media activity, isn't actually even collected in the workplace, right? But it's still that's data that's being fed into companies that people work for. So a lot of this data employers can actually buy from data brokers, or they contract with other vendors to collect it. So examples of worker data include like a criminal record that could be part of this historical data that they get somehow. Cognitive or behavioral data, most famously personality tests that job applicants might have to take. Then there's your digital footprint. So it could be social media activity, things that are happening not actually on work time, but things that you're posting to your accounts. Health and wellness data that could be very intrusive. It could be like linked to a Fitbit or some wearable about your heart rate, for instance. Biometric data, facial recognition, looking at your body language. Um, then there's job activity data, like if you're a driver, for instance, it could be monitoring braking patterns. And then workplace activities. So it could be monitoring whether you're at your desk in the building. So I could spend the rest of the night talking through all these types of data being collected, but the real point is that is a lot of data. So next slide. Yeah, you got ahead of me there. uh, all this data collection, all this data-driven technologies, nothing could possibly going wrong. Everything is fine, right? Um, Next slide. Yeah, that's not actually true. So, well, let's talk about harms, right? I find it useful to organize these harms into three categories. The first harm is the harm of the actual data collection. So the electronic monitoring of workers can actually have harmful impacts itself. And that's what studies have shown. They've shown that electronic monitoring, no matter the characteristics of the monitoring, consistently to lead to worker stress. And that monitoring can have psychological effects like depression, anxiety, emotional exhaustion, burnout, or it can have physiological effects like higher rates of back pain, headaches, neck, and shoulder stiffness. Next slide. And then there's the other harms. So the second harm is exploitation. Data can be used to exploit workers. It can be used to manage workers and then extract more from their work. One example is data being used to manage the productivity of Amazon workers. So they create and measure and use this metric called time off tasks that's derived from data from the scanners that warehouse workers use, and then use that time off task metric to discipline workers. And that creates pressure for workers to produce more and more. And these productivity pressures through data-driven algorithmic management are documented to increase stress and injuries. This third type of harm is also from how data is used. In this case, it's used to automate tasks or jobs which have been done by human workers. So vast amounts of data being used to train powerful AI systems like generative AI, which can be used to create content. And for instance, there's AI writing software that generates TV and movie scripts, and that can threaten the livelihoods of writers that we saw so famously. So maybe people can drop in the chat. What kinds of harms do you identify with in any of the ones that we've covered? Or are there other types of harms that you want to raise that could come about with data collection and use? So feel free to drop that from the chat. I mean, some of it you already brought up, surveillance, right? That could be a harm that we talked about already. All right, I'm gonna keep going, but feel free. Oh yeah, yep, biometric data for sure. Feel free to drop stuff in the chat. So as you know, unregulated data collection and use, which fuels new digital technology, and it's unlimited in its ability to drive surveillance, exploitation, automation. That may seem fun, but it is also entirely dangerous. And thanks for people chatting in the chat, data being leaked, learning our patterns and behaviors outside of work, perhaps. Yeah, these are all harms. So let's talk about our rights. What can we do in this situation? There's no comprehensive federal regulation of data, and there's actually no state that regulates worker data with one exception, the notable exception of the California Consumer Privacy Act. And that's why this is such an incredibly big deal. So for the first time ever in the US, workers in California have rights around their worker data. So these are the 5 rights workers have under the CCPA. Workers have the right to know when the business they work for is collecting data on them. Workers have the right to get access to their worker data. Workers have the right to correct and delete their data. Workers have the right to opt out of a business's sale or sharing of their worker data. And workers have the right to limit businesses' use of their sensitive data. So who is covered by the CCPA? It's both consumers and workers. And the really incredible thing about the CCPA is that it's expansive in what it considers as a worker. So all employees and independent contractors, as well as former employees and job applicants are considered workers and covered under the CCPA. You do have to work at a large for-profit business for the CCPA to cover you. That's in California. And workers also have to be California residents. Labor subcontractors or service providers, importantly, are also covered by the CCPA. So lots of worker data is covered. So basically like what we talked about in the beginning of the presentation, every kind of data from personal ID to geolocation data, audiovisual data, these are the types of data that are covered under the CCPA. Sensitive worker data, there's a special category in the CCPA for this, and that's like things like your social security number or financial login information, or it could be sensitive demographic information about your sexual orientation, or interesting enough, your union membership. That's defined as sensitive worker data. So using your rights, let's actually get into some of the nitty gritty of using your rights. So much of data collection and use is opaque to workers. So, think of the Uber drivers who get deactivated without even knowing why. There's a fundamental information asymmetry between employers who seem to know everything about workers and workers who barely have any information. And so in this presentation and our work so far, we focus on the right of workers to access their own worker data under the CCPA because of its potential value to workers and organizers. So with this right, workers finally have a tool that could shed light on their company's practices and begin to challenge unfair ones. So there is a right. Under the CCPA, workers can request data that the business they work for has sold, shared, or disclosed. And then here, the slide gives you the list of information that a business must disclose in a request. Um, this is basically what we legally expect, but what we may get may actually be a little bit different than this, right? And also to note, the right to access your data is still pretty new. And so only a few organizations have experimented with it. We get to hear from Jason a little bit later on, which is really exciting. But we also are still learning how much people will get out of their data and how the information be useful once you do get it. But so far, it is the best tool we have right now, and we're happy as a labor center to support people to try it out. Yes, unfortunately, working for the Berkeley lab counts as a nonprofit, as I understand. Um, Here's an example from Home Depot for their associates or their workers about like in the first category, you can see what is the information. The second is the sources of information. The third is sort of the purposes of the information. And then the fourth is sort of the sources of where the information can be disclosed to. So that's just giving you a little flavor of sort of like in the privacy statement, how this kind of like types of data that may work. Next slide. That's just another one. It also collects biometric information. So that's another category of data that Home Depot is collecting about its associates. And now we get to walk you through the basics of making a CCPA data access request. 7 easy steps, or potentially not so easy steps. Note that we're not lawyers, so this isn't legal advice. So take that with what we can. So these are the steps. First, you decide who will make the data request. You prepare for any possible risk of retaliation. You select your method of request. You write your request. You verify your request and your identity. And then importantly, you track your company's responses and analyze the response. Also, if you're a consumer, you can also test this out as a consumer. We all are consumers. Um, the CCPA allows you to make the data request yourself, or you can designate what is called an authorized agent. And so this authorized agent could be an organization like a union or a worker center or tech equity. The worker has to give the authorized agent signed permission to make the request. And then the business can ask the agent to provide proof that they have this signed permission. Now, why bother with this? I mean, really the advantage of an authorized agent is that there's a lot of steps perhaps in making a request and following through. So it may not be so easy. So there might be a lot of back and forth required with the business, and a person or organization that's dedicated to the process may be able to provide some very necessary support. This is a little picture of a permission slip, which is an app that Consumer Reports has for consumers, which acts on behalf of them to opt out of the sale and sharing of their data or delete their data. So this is an example of some people using authorized agents. So retaliation can be a reality. We don't advise you on what your particular risks are, what choices to make, but we'll obviously advise you to prepare and evaluate your risks. So making a data request does identify you to the company. Using an authorized agent still involves identifying you as someone making a data request. That said, you might decide the risk is low or the value of the request is worth it. And, the key is to be prepared. So the CCPA does provide legal protections against retaliation for anyone exercising their CCPA rights. Another thing you might consider is if there are other coworkers who are interested in making a request, and then this could be a group activity. And then, of course, you should consult other folks. You can consult union representatives or your legal counsel. This is a slice from the CCPA. As you can see in Clause E at the bottom, it explicitly names that a business shall not retaliate against an employee or a worker. So a business must provide at least 2 methods for making data requests. One of them is toll-free number. The other methods could be a web form, email, mail, or in person. You can consider testing different methods of requests if there's multiple people making a request. So an automated response to a web form might result in less information than if a company has to respond to a letter that details the specific information. This is an example from Whole Foods. This is a web form that they have for people to make automated requests. They also have a toll-free phone number. So writing your data request, well, we got a shortcut for you, so that's great. The toolkit provides a template data access request letter. Thank you to Power Switch Action for sharing theirs. And then you can add a lot of information about the time period of the request or a list of data. So all of this is contained in the template letter for you all to use as well. That's the snapshot of the template letter. And then you have to verify your request. So you may have to verify your identity. You could see in the next slide that there's a little example from Whole Foods about verifying your identity, which is basically verifying your email that they have on file for you. And then you track the company's response to your request. So you might need to document their responses and their dates of responses because the CCPA has strict requirements about when and how a company responds to data access requests. And then the last step, step 7, is to analyze the response, right? So first, did they respond with your data within the time frame that's required from the CCPA? Then you want to analyze the response and see if it's complete with all the data you expected. Is it accurate with correct information? Is it intelligible? You may need to follow up with the if the company didn't comply. So, and ultimately there is enforcement. So that if you have a violation, you can file a complaint with the California Privacy Protection Agency. And this is the agency that has the power to enforce the CCPA. This other shot is a little bit about from a food delivery platform for a consumer. And in this case, the age was wrong. In this case, they noted homeowner or renter, which is really interesting, and that was also wrong. So you can note that there's often incorrect information that they have about you. And then in the next, you can see sort of this like not so useful format, JSON file that was produced from another data access request. Um, so just giving you a little bit of flavor of what you see, but obviously you have further resources. You can check out our toolkit. You can check out Power Switch Actions, pop ed tools as well. And you can contact me and you can email me at kung@berkeley.edu. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kong. That's great. I'm gonna stop this share now. Um, cool. All right. And Jason, we'll get into questions and all of that, but Jason, I'd love to hear more about your own experience. Obviously, we know that Uber and Lyft drivers are among the most surveilled workers in the US with a lot of data collected about you. So I'd love to hear more about what inspired you to investigate this and what your experience was like with the CPPA.
Absolutely. Yeah, this was continuous with some concerns that me and the other members of Gig Workers Rising had. We're a group of drivers who are trying to keep abreast of the legal situation and pay fairness and other concerns that drivers like ourselves have. We have some partnerships with Working Partnerships USA, and thank you very much, Tech Equity, for bringing us so we can speak on this. Um, yeah, about a year ago, Gig Workers Rising found out through a lawyer about this CCPA, and we thought it would be applicable to some of the concerns that we've had. For me, I think a lot of the drivers should know the nature of the surveillance that we're under. I mean, every driver knows that we're being monitored through our phone and et cetera. But knowing maybe that the accelerometer data is what they're collecting or other such things can help us protect ourselves. Of course, drivers are always concerned about fair pay. We have doubts about whether we're getting fair pay, and we want to make sure that each ride actually pays us the correct amount. And something that we've been discussing for a couple years is unfair deactivation. Now, it happens to drivers, and unfortunately, it's not uncommon that we just get a message from Uber or Lyft when we try to sign on to the platform saying, you know, you violated the terms of service. And this could come from just a disgruntled passenger, really anybody. And it's often just a false accusation. And having a full data set from the CCPA could help us protect ourselves from this, could show that these were, you know, specious and false accusations. So we like to have this data at hand. And, you know, also the way I think of it is, you know, who am I to Lyft? I am data, right? That is basically what they think of me. Um, Really, this is also maybe the one of the toughest situations to get a CCPA request through, because they don't respect us as employees. You know, they barely want to think of us as anything. We just think of us as somebody who just signed on to the platform, and they really do everything they can to minimize our rights as workers. Um, Given that that's the case, this was pretty straightforward. So, like I said, Gig Workers Rising, I was talking with a lawyer in order to formulate the request. I think it was probably similar to the template data access letter that's available now. If I had that, you know, I could have done it myself. I honestly think I could have done it myself without a lawyer. Anyway, it's straightforward. You pretty much just make the request. Um, some people in the group requested their data from Uber. I requested my data from Lyft. There were some differences. Uber gave more data out than I got, but I'll talk about what data I got and what the process was. Um, so we sent an email. They responded with an email saying, we see that you are concerned about your privacy and the privacy of your data. something like, rest assured, we are total angels. We would never do anything untoward or sneaky with your data. That's not a direct quote, but it was basically, hey, just trust us. We have your data and we protect it. Not something I trust. So I had to reiterate and send a similar message and request to know that they are actually taking steps to release the data. They responded similarly with another, not very assuring verbiage. But on the third request, they sent a link to something I'd never seen on the driver portal before at Lyft, which was a way to download data. So a click of the link, and it was a download of a zip file with a bunch of CSV. So a lot of spreadsheets. The spreadsheets contained information like what my text conversations with passengers had been, where I picked people up, dropped them off, and when, and things personally about me, what cars I've been driving on the platform, and other things. I don't think it was a full data set. One of the things that it was missing was the pay data. So I think this is, maybe an ongoing process, and I am going to look into that. But I did get a lot of data, and it was relatively straightforward. And yeah, so another thing that's useful for us to do it this way is, if we come together and have an authorized agent, which was mentioned before, we can pool our data together. We're trying to get about 200 drivers to make this request, and then we can see
Wow.
other patterns in the data. Yeah, and show algorithmic things that they would do, that we, needs to stick up for our rights. And yeah, so it's a little bit of an ongoing process, but relatively straightforward. And like me, a lot of people are just they are data to their employers. A lot of people who work in an algorithmic job. So I think everybody should really have this bunch of data. And yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Actually, Kung, I'm curious if just hearing from Jason's story, did that raise it? Do you have any like reactions to it or any questions? No, no worries if not, but I was just like, that was great to hear the whole experience from your perspective. Just curious if that raises anything for Kung and what you've heard from other folks you've talked to um, about exercising these rights.
Well, one thing is it's just like I appreciate Gig Workers Rising and Jason, all the leaders that were part of your team that did this, because it's really paving the way for other folks, including on this call, to do it. So it's really like setting an example, and that's really excellent. And I think the other thing that struck me, Jason, about what you said is like you guys did this collectively and continue to want to do this collectively. And I think that's also really beautiful in terms of like asserting our rights collectively and seeing data which sometimes seems like limited to the individual, like seeing it really as a collective exercise and being able to learn from that.
Hmm. And yeah, Jason, I'm curious, like since Gig Worker Rising is, a national organization, have you talked to folks in other states about what you've learned through exercising these rights in California as well?
Yeah, we have a national presence, but really it's focused on the Bay Area. All the
Gotcha.
driver leaders are here, but we've had protests where we had people come in from Chicago and Denver and different places that to go to Uber headquarters, which is right here. So we're in
Awesome.
conversation with them, and we'd love for their states to pass similar measures, but we should
Awesome.
definitely use it here where we can.
Cool. Sounds good. That sounds good to me. Awesome. So if folks, I'm sure this has raised some questions for folks. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature, and I'll field some of these questions to our panelists. As we get into the Q&A function, we will stop recording.